Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Scares That Shaped Us, a podcast about horror writers and the stories that made them. I'm your host, Matthew Jackson. I hope everybody's having a good week. I got in late last week after a week in Colorado with my family, and I was very tired, and I just wanted to stay home and do nothing. But I had a ticket for the Thursday night, 7 p.m. show of Sinners. And y'all, it was worth being tired. It was worth every second. I would watch it again in a heartbeat. I can't wait to watch it again. Ryan Coogler's Sinners, I know I'm the millionth person to tell you this, is amazing. It is a new American horror classic, a fantastic vampire movie, a fantastic piece of social horror. It's great. If you haven't already bought your tickets, get your tickets. You're going to want to see this one. You're going to want to talk about this one with everybody. I cannot recommend it enough. But we are not here to talk about Sinners today. We are going to talk to our guest this week, Joshua Chaplinsky. He is here to talk about his 2024 novel, Letters to the Purple Satin Killer, which is an amazing epistolary true crime riff kind of horror novel. It's great. We're going to talk about how he conceived that novel and structured it and figured out how to make it work as a piece of long form writing. We're also going to talk about the infamous, the notorious, the first viral death video, although it's not really a death video because a lot of it is fake. Faces of Death is the topic that Joshua brought to us. I had never seen this movie all the way through until I realized it was going to be on the show. It's a trip. It's a strange cultural artifact from the late 1970s. We get into that. We talk about our respective journeys to horror, how that changes from childhood to adulthood, and how being terrified of something as a child can actually turn into something very positive when you're older. It's a fantastic conversation, and we are going to get right to it. So to sum up, see Sinners, and now stay tuned for our interview with Joshua Chaplinsky. Joining us this week on The Scares That Shaped Us is the author of one of the most fascinating horror books I read in 2024. He is the writer behind books like Kanye West Reanimator, Whispers in the Ear of a Dreaming Ape, The Paradox Twins, and last year's amazing Letters to the Purple Satin Killer. Joshua Chaplinsky, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Matthew. I'm glad to be here.
Letters to the Purple Satin Killer is an amazing concept for a horror novel. It comes together in a great way. It pays off in ways that I think readers might not expect it to pay off. In some ways, they may expect if you like this kind of fiction. For anyone who doesn't know about this book yet, could you give us a little teaser of what Letters to the Purple Satin Killer is?
Sure. It's an epistolary novel, which means it's told in the form of letters. But what I think makes this book unique is that all the letters are written to the titular killer, and you never actually hear a response from the Purple Satin Killer. So the entire story is told from the point of view of other people outside of his sphere, relatives, just deranged fans, women who are in love with him, even relatives of victims, and even maybe victims who got away from him. So everything's told. The whole story is told. Everything you learn about him is told to you by other people, basically. So there's a level of unreliability to it as well.
Yeah, it's such a great idea, and I know that a segment of it is in Whispers in the Ear of a Dreaming Ape, which I did not actually know when I read Purple Satin Killer, and then I went back and started reading more of your short fiction. How long was this thing coming together? Because it feels like a really it's a very substantial novel, and it feels like a massive undertaking to sort of put a chronology and all these points of view together.
Yeah, well, it started as a short story, and that short story was originally published in Thuglit magazine, rest in peace, edited by Todd Robinson, and then was reprinted in my short story collection, Whispers in the Ear of a Dreaming Ape. And I never really intended to expand on it, but after my short story collection came out, I put out a novel called The Paradox Twins. And then after that, I was working on another novel, a more not straightforward, but more fully immersed in the horror genre, horror novel. And I kind of hit a wall with it, and I really wanted to get something finished and out there. And so I started thinking about what other options I had, and I was like, well, Letters to the Purple Satin Killer would be an easy thing to kind of expand, maybe to like a 20,000 word novella. Maybe, Clash would be interested in just putting that out there as like a stopgap release, so people don't forget about me while I'm trying to work out the kinks in this other story. And so I started working on it, thinking it was gonna be, this quick, easy thing, and it wasn't. And it kept getting longer and longer, and every time I was like, "Oh, this isn't working," the answer always seemed to be, "That's because you're half-assing it. It's got to be longer. It's got to be developed better." And so I was just like, "All right, well, let's see where this goes." And 90,000 words later, we have Letters to the Purple Satin Killer, the novel, some 5 or so years after I published the short story.
So as you mentioned, there are numerous perspectives in the book. There are characters that we get to know very intimately, like the killer's mother, and this one particular person who's sort of claiming to be an academic, but then has sort of ulterior motives. You have the deranged fans. Then there are people who just sort of pop in for maybe one or two letters that are just sort of weird, offbeat things, and then they disappear. Did you build this out chronologically? Did you work a lot on one character? And that, like, I can't imagine being in his mother's head for longer than like 15 minutes at a time. How did you piece this together in a way that like a narrative through line could flow?
Yeah, well, the mother was one of the original characters from the original short story, and so I knew she was kind of like one of the core characters. So I knew she had to like kind of carry a lot of the narrative weight of the book. But I made the mistake of writing it out of order because when I decided I was going to expand it, I kind of had one or two ideas for like new characters that could write to him, just based on, oh, this is a funny idea. What if like this guy who was in a metal band and was obsessed with him started writing to him and something like that. And so, I would start writing a handful of letters from this one character, and then I would come up with another character, and I'd be like, oh, all right, this is a cool idea. Let me do this. And then I started, as I was doing that, I was like, well, I kind of need an overarching kind of through line to the whole thing. So I started adding letters to the original characters, and at one point it did kind of become a bit of a logistical nightmare, especially since like every letter, is dated at the top. So there's a timeline, and he's in jail for a certain amount of years, and there's this trial. So it's a I wanted to be really meticulous about building the timeline, but by writing it out of order, I made that very difficult on myself. So there was a point where, I had outlines, I had note cards, I was printing everything out and rearranging it on my floor and reading everything by one character and then like changing the orders around. And it really, for a while there, was touch and go. It became pretty difficult. Um, Yeah, but in the end, I think it was really important to me that even if the reader isn't looking at all the dates and being like, wait a minute, how could this come now when this happened over here? You know, it was really important to me to get it right, even if it wasn't noticed.
Yeah, reading it, I couldn't help but wonder, like, what would the reading experience be if you had arranged it by character? If you had just let us read every letter from one character and then another character, and but the way that it's arranged, and as you were explaining that, I sort of picture you with a giant cork board and red string connecting all of these things in a massive Pepe Silvia web. I just had that image of you with the
I mean
cork board
that's
and
more or less what it was like, except it was me on my knees on the floor with pages spread everywhere, the cat coming by, walking across the pages, and me shooing her away, and it was yeah, it was an experience.
So remind me, what is the Purple Satin Killer's real name? It's like on the tip of my tongue, and I keep forgetting it.
It's Jonas Williker.
Jonas Williker, yes, which is an amazing name for a killer.
That's
Like
funny
you
because
said,
at one point my wife was like, I don't know about that name. Maybe you should change it. And I was like, it's too late now. I'm too far in. In my head, that's his name,
that's his name. Yeah.
for
Well,
better or worse.
it's very interesting the way that the book keeps the reader off balance in our perception of him. And you have this sort of prologue piece sort of setting up who he is, what he did, and it gets graphic and it gets scary. And then you sort of start reading these letters from his mother and these letters from people who are just asking him very simple questions, and you get the sense he is still unknowable, which I think is such a different way of approaching it from a lot of sort of true crime informed or true crime inspired pieces. Do you feel like you know him at all? Did you ever, were you ever tempted to like put in little bits of him more?
No, I mean, I knew from the beginning, like we would never hear from him. Like that was important to me. That was kind of the hook to me, was that you never heard from him, and everything you learn about him is from other people. So again, by design, like different people have different impressions. Some people knew him better than others, and so some people, there might be conflicting information, conflicting viewpoints. Um, yeah, I never really considered giving him more of a voice. And when I initially thought of that, it was like, oh, this is kind of like a neat little trick. It's like a fun hook for the book. But then as I was writing it, and I was doing some research and reading stuff, and like a more modern um opinion of like a lot of true crime media and our obsession with true crime and serial killers is that, there's the idea that making documentaries about serial killers, you're giving them a voice and you're like, glorifying them and stuff. And so I've seen a lot of people say, oh, I don't like to read that sort of thing because I don't want to be in that headspace or be in the head of a serial killer for 400 pages. And so I feel by not having any responses from him, not hearing from the killer directly, I kind of like skip over that, and it's more about the victims and their voice and their characters, because really there are all these little mini stories throughout of of the individuals who are writing to him, and I feel like it's really, the book is almost more about them than it is about him. And I think that was refreshing for some people, or some people appreciated that, or they weren't as put off by the subject matter. By telling it from other people's point of view, you kind of make it more palatable.
Yeah. Well, and it reminded me of, I think this book, I mean, first of all, it's just a great standalone novel and people should go read it. But I think it fortuitously came out around the same time as the film Red Rooms, which was one of my
Mm,
favorite horror films of last year, and does a similar thing. That the killer in that story appears on screen but never actually really speaks. You never really get to know him. You don't actually see his crimes. You occasionally hear them,
mm.
but they're both pieces that challenge the way that we view stuff like this, because we've been so conditioned to think of these things in terms of body counts and crime scene photos and the sort of grisly details. um did you see Red Rooms, by the way?
I I did. I thought it was a great movie.
Yeah, it's brilliant, and i I find them to be, what, like, how has working on this book in this specific way with this specific approach affected your relationship to serial killer narratives and true crime narratives and stuff like that?
I mean, it definitely forced me to think about it more, like how the media we consume, and how it's almost like we're consuming other people's trauma as entertainment, because I like true crime as much as anybody else. And when I wrote the original short story, it kind of been inspired by Making a Murderer. I had been watching that around that time. So that's kind of where the impetus for the whole thing came from. And So I can't even say that initially I was kind of as progressively minded to be like, well, I have to, you know, parse this idea of consuming this kind of media and telling stories from the point of view of the victim or whatever. But kind of as I was writing the novel and those points of views kind of crept in from some of the characters, I don't know. I kind of discovered it along the way, that, oh, this is meant to be like this because it's a kind of a more modern way to tell a serial killer story and to kind of, you know, look at our relationship to, horrific crimes as entertainment.
Well, I think that is as good a transition as any as we're going to get to
Oh,
the story you brought to us today. And this was a treat for me. Well, treat is probably the wrong word. This was an experience for me because I had actually never sat down and watched this film all the way through
wow.
until we decided that this was what we were going to talk about. So, Joshua and I are going to talk about the 1978 film Faces of Death, the infamous banned in 40 some odd countries film that is essentially a faux documentary about death in all its forms, and spawned many sequels and many uh, torrents and files on download sites claiming to be from Faces of Death, even though they definitely were not. Joshua, when did you first encounter this film?
Oh man, it was at a grade school sleepover. Um, I wasn't like super young. I want to say maybe it was like fifth grade or sixth grade, something like that. Slept over a friend's house, and I went to a private school, a Christian school, so I was already, kind of a sheltered kid at this point. Like I wasn't allowed to see R-rated movies or anything like that. I was barely allowed to see like PG-rated movies at that point. So going over someone else's house who kind of had more freedom was like, you know, it was like this. I was anticipating. I was like, yeah, like what am I going to get to see? What am I going to get to watch? And we all took a trip to the video store back in the day, and like this is even before I think Blockbuster or anything. So we went to one of your mom and pops where like anything and everything was on the shelf, and you know, they let a bunch of sixth graders rent a bunch of you know R-rated movies, and so we rented the two that I remember. The we rented The Exorcist, which that comes later, but and the other one was Faces of Death. And my kind of like at that point, like when my friends had like latched onto that, they're like, yeah, yeah, Faces of Death, we gotta watch this. I was like, my kind of like anticipation turned to dread, and I was like, oh no, like I'm in over my head. Like this sounds awful. Like this is supposed to be a video of real people getting, real people being murdered, all this kind of gruesome stuff. And so like I was just became so anxious and like my stomach hurt and like I was not enjoying myself at all. Like I was just the whole time dreading having to watch this movie. And so then later in the evening, when my friend's dad, his parents were divorced, so we were at his dad's place, and so my friend's dad goes to sleep, and after we had tired of watching Playboy because his dad had Playboy, and I remember his dad's last parting words before he went to the bed were, "All right, kids, now don't stay up all night watching Playboy." So he obviously didn't really care too much what we did. So after we got tired of that, they put on Faces of Death, and I kind of sat as far away from the TV as I possibly could with like a pillow pulled up in front of me and just like trying to hide behind it without my friends seeing, so they wouldn't start picking on me and calling me a pussy. And we put on Faces of Death, and it starts out with all that like kind of like autopsy footage, like uh, the actual footage of doctors performing an autopsy. And rewatching it the other night, one thing scene I remembered specifically was like how they kind of like peeled the skin back off the guy's face, and I just remember being so horrified by that, and I remembered it so vividly, and it was just like exactly as I remembered it, watching it, rewatching it, I don't know what is 35 years later or whatever, you know, and yeah, and it just, I mean, it went from there. It was just an awful experience. I mean, just sitting through it all. And back then there was no like, I didn't have the wherewithal to recognize the cheesiness of a lot of it and what was now to me is so obviously faked. And it just really, oh man, it was just really it was a terrible experience. I sat through that entire movie. And so when it was over, I was done. I was like, sleep over, done. I'm going to bed. Like, I want nothing to do with anything else. And everyone else is like, we're watching The Exorcist. And they throw on The Exorcist. And I go completely in the other room and try to go to sleep. And I vividly remember like being in this sort of like feverish half sleep the entire night. And like the demonic screams of The Exorcist, you know, coming in and out of my dreams. And like, so just overall, it was just a horrible experience, excruciating night. I was like, I hate this. I hate horror. I hate movies. I don't want to. And from that point on, I was like, I was the most squeamish kid, even in like just the tamest PG movies. Like I couldn't take violence or any sort of suspense or tension. Like I hated it. That it really did a number on me. So I mean, that was my initial experience with Faces of Death, and you know, this 35 years, whatever it was later, this is the first time I've watched it since.
Wow. Like the combination of Playboy and Faces of Death is just the most like
Oh,
kid taboo. We're gonna do all the stuff our parents don't want us to see. I also am fascinated by the Christian upbringing part of it because it's similar to my experience. Like as longtime listeners know, I was not allowed near horror movies as a kid, and I had the father who was very like, you can't watch a PG-13 movie until you turn 13. That's why they're PG-13, and it which was really frustrating because I was surrounded by kids whose lives were more permissive, not necessarily to the Playboy Faces of Death level, but I had friends who would come to school and talk all about Freddie and Jason and how they'd watched all the Nightmare on Elm Streets over the weekend in like fourth and fifth grade. And I had friends who they knew all the PG-13 movies, all the raunchy jokes, and I would go over to their houses for sleepovers, and my dad had laid down the law so clearly that I remember vividly once. I think it was Ace Ventura. My my friends wanted to watch Ace Ventura, and I was like, "Yeah, let's watch Ace Ventura." And the mom at the sleepover stopped us and said, "Matthew, I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to watch Ace
oh
Ventura.
man.
Tell me the truth. Are you allowed to watch Ace Ventura?" And I was so scared to get in trouble that I went, "No, I'm not allowed." So, we went into that kid's bedroom and played Mortal Kombat 2 on Sega Genesis. There's nothing violent or disturbing about that at
Yeah.
all. Um, I cannot imagine watching this movie at the age of like 9, 10, 11 years old. As like me personally, as a kid who was, it wasn't that I was squeamish necessarily, but I had been told so many times that that stuff wasn't for me that I had built it up in my mind to such a degree. And the thing about Faces of Death, um, for those of you who haven't seen it, and if you want to watch it, it's on Shudder right now. You can go stream it. It was hard to find for a really long time, but it is like a good probably 60% of it is fake stuff, is visual effects, and it's presented in this very dry faux documentary style with a narrator. So it's not like a fun watch to begin with. It's not like you're going to watch something like a Lucio Fulci movie where you're going to get like a fun story and a zombie fighting a shark. It's just a guy going, and now we go to this cult where they're going to eat a man alive, and
Yeah.
and you're going, what? Um,
Yeah, it's not exciting.
no, it's really not. But it does have this quality to it that even now, like I'm almost 39 years old. I had never seen it before. I sat down and watched it start to finish. Those scenes in the morgue, which are actually like that's actual footage of cadavers
Hmm.
in the morgue sequences. Some of it, maybe not all of it, but it is haunting stuff. And I think some of that has to do with the sort of gritty 70s aesthetic of it all. But it is such a weird hybrid movie because the guy who made it, whose name is John Allen Schwartz, he's credited as Alan Black, I think is the name he chose for the directing credit. Um, he said he wanted to make like a very analytical film about death and how we view death, and like maybe 40% of the film is that, but then you have like, and now here's seal clubbing, and you're like, what's analytical about this? You're just, which by the way, they didn't actually kill seals.
That
Don't
was
worry.
one of the things that was faked.
Don't
Yes,
worry, they didn't kill seals, and they didn't eat that monkey, that little monkey's brains.
that
That
poor
was
monkey.
I
Although, still that monkey, the monkey before they go to the brain eating, that monkey, poor monkey, was in some distress.
Yeah, it's very clearly not happy about anything that's happening, but they at least did not kill that monkey and eat its brains.
Yeah.
Um, it's such a weird hybrid because you see these moments, especially now in 2025, and a lot of it you're just like, yeah, whatever, that's sensationalist exploitation filmmaking crap. But then you see those shots in the morgue where the camera is moving in this really haunting sort of glidey way around these like rib cages and skin being pulled off of skulls. And like I've seen things like that before, and like I know what happens to us when we die. It's not a mystery to me, but even I was looking at it going, "Oh my god. This is heavy." So you mentioned having the horrible experience of this. And you and I talked a little before we started recording about your journey in horror and being sort of scarred by Faces of Death and hating horror. So what was the path back like for you once this movie hit you that hard? How did you sort of find your way back to it?
Yeah. Well, before I go forward, I want to go back just a little bit because some of the things you were saying kind of awakened some memories inside me.
Oh, sure.
I was saying how I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated movies. I was very sheltered. But then I remember thinking it wasn't necessarily always that way because Faces of Death wasn't the first movie or horror media to scar me. Like I have had a history of seeing things I probably shouldn't have, and then just, just the fear being harbored inside me. The very first thing I could remember that really like scared the bejesus out of me was when I was younger. I was a huge Michael Jackson fan. So one day, and we had MTV when I was younger, when it like we had HBO, we had MTV, which was weird because even though later on I wasn't really allowed to watch stuff, like my parents were like early adopters of cable, and like I don't know, in 1986 or something like that, I must have been like 10 years old, and my parents had me young, and they were probably still young, so they were a little more permissive at that time. So there was this big premiere for the Michael Jackson Thriller video, directed by John Landis, and I didn't know. The album Thriller had come out and I loved it and I listened to it nonstop. So then, but when they were airing this video, I didn't really have any concept of what the content of the video was going to be. And surprisingly, my mother was just like, "Hey, they're premiering a new Michael Jackson video. You want to watch it?" And I was like, "Yeah." And we sit down and we're watching it. And of course, it starts with the whole, like, it's like a short film, the whole preamble of Michael Jackson and this girl on a date. And then it gets a little spooky, and I think they're in the movie theater or something, and she's scared, and she's hugging on him while he's eating the popcorn and all that. And then so, I'm watching this, and I'm like, well, when are we gonna get to the music? What is this? But and like, you know, as a testament to the filmmaking, I'm starting to get this feeling like this is a little spooky, and I'm uncomfortable with this. I don't like where this is going. This might be scary. And then all of a sudden it reaches that moment where he turns to her and he's got the glowing eyes and he's starting to turn to a werewolf. And I was like, no, thank you. I was like up and out of the room. And my mother was like, come here, what's wrong with you? You love Michael Jackson, come back and watch this. And I was just like, nope, nope. And then that image of him with those glowing eyes it was the stuff of nightmares for me for years. And I just wouldn't watch that video, until I was an adult. And so thinking back to how my mother like encouraged me and was like almost making fun of me for not, for being scared, it's striking me now as interesting that later on she was so much more strict with me about what I watched, you know?
Well, this is funny because my whole family no horror allowed thing came from, well, it came from a couple of things. One was my father had read a book. This was when my father was very into. Sorry if I get any of these details wrong, Dad. I love you. He was very into like he got back into Jesus. Basically, he went through his like wild teenage years, and then I think if I can sort of theorize a little bit, what happened was he had a kid and started a family, and he started thinking, I need to be a responsible leader of my family, so I should go back to church. And he did, and he met a preacher who sort of steered him away from rock and roll
Hmm.
and violent movies and sex and things like that. And so he sort of tamed down a little bit, and he read this book about Halloween and its links to Satanism or whatever, and basically came away with the lesson that God does not want us to be afraid. God does not want us to chase scary stories around because that is creating unnecessary fear in our lives. And that was his guiding principle for a lot of my childhood, was like, you don't need to be scared by stuff that is completely made up. There's no point, so I am not exposing you to this. And I think that I had a couple of experiences like that thriller experience where I would see something or hear something or watch something that would freak me out. And it was reinforcing his philosophy where he was like, see, he's scared. He's scared.
Hmm.
Whereas like, another parent might have been like, oh, he's 6 years old. Of course he's scared of that thing. Like, he'll get over it. Whatever. He's a kid. My dad was like, no, no, no. See, this is proving that I'm right, and he doesn't need to go after the horror stuff. So I think he clamped down. But what was funny about that was there would be these little trickles. I just talked to Nat Cassidy, and we were talking about this a little bit, where like he would show me the Indiana Jones movies, which are not horror movies, but they have those moments that will like freak you right the hell out as a kid. And I remember I wasn't allowed to watch the end of Last Crusade where the guy drinks from the wrong grail and turns to dust. My dad thought that was too scary. But like a week before that, I was allowed to watch the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark where all the faces melt. And I didn't really understand the distinction. So it was a very interesting like do you have siblings?
I do. I'm the oldest. I have a brother who's about 2.5 years younger, and then a brother who's 10 years younger.
Yeah, I have two younger sisters who are 4 years younger and 9 years younger, and I think that as they came into the picture, I think my parents started to kind of tighten the leash a little more, and it
Oh,
wasn't
really?
until I had my own like I got a part-time job and had my own money and my own car when I was like 16, and then I could go to the video store and rent movies. And at that point, my dad was kind of like, "Okay, he's basically an adult now. Let's just let
Hmm.
him try stuff." So, did you ever talk to your parents about this like period in your life and why this was the case?
No, I mean, I've jokingly, now that I'm much older, I have jokingly, like when my mother is like, she's recently read Letters to the Purple Satin Killer, and she is
Mm.
like, she doesn't like gore, horror, tension, any of that at all. Like she just wants movies to be nice, have no conflict. So she really doesn't like that stuff. And so for her to read this book was kind of, I think a lot to ask. And but she was a trooper and she finished it, and she, she, told me she thought it was really, really well done and all this stuff. But, um yeah, so she's, but in the beginning when I was writing and she was first reading my stuff and like where I talk about movies I like and horror movies and stuff, she's always like, "Oh, how could you watch that? Why do you like that stuff?" And I was like, "It's because you denied me when I was a kid. You wouldn't let me, and and I wanted to see it real bad, and I got a taste for it, and that's why I'm so into it, is because you wouldn't let me watch it." So I kind of like tease her with that, but I think that maybe there's an element of truth in that, because
That's
when I did eventually start to turn, it was almost a conscious decision. Um, and it didn't really even start with horror because, like I said, I was pretty squeamish. And like, even as far as like, action movies like Arnold Schwarzenegger movies and stuff like Rambo or Terminator and stuff, like I was afraid to watch those movies because of the blood, like I was too squeamish. But then like, when Terminator 2 came out and Alien 3 came out, I was a little older and I was like, man, those movies look so cool. I want to see those movies. I like everything about that. I'm just scared of the blood. And so I kind of, at that point, made a conscious decision. I was like, I'm going to slowly condition myself, to be able to watch this stuff because I want to watch these movies. And I kind of recognized my fear at that point as a bit irrational, or just like, I don't know, just a little, it was too much. And I was like, it's preventing me from doing the things I want. So it kind of, my foray back into that started with just kind of like, I don't know, movies probably most kids were already watching and wouldn't even think were that upsetting. Like mostly action movies and stuff like that.
yeah. I had it was never blood for me, I don't think, but I sort of went off it was a different experience for me because when I got the part-time job, I started talking. I made friends there, and one of a few of them were like into horror movies, and one in particular, my friend Lance would tell me, here's the basis of Halloween, like here's the backstory, and here's the backstory of Friday the 13th, and here's the backstory of A Nightmare on Elm Street. And it was just like, I feel like I'm missing something culturally, which I
Hmm.
think is a big thing that Faces of Death sort of trafficked in, and other movies like it, in that sort of, you have to see this or you're gonna miss some sort of nerve that has hit all these other people, and you need to know what it feels like. Um, so it was this kind of sense of, I got to keep up. I got to figure out what this is all about, and went into that kind of stuff and developed a taste for it, and I went through that period, which did not include Faces of Death because I could never find it, but
Hmm.
I went through that period where it was like, okay, you thought Friday the 13th was graphic. Now you have to watch Evil Dead. Oh,
Hmm.
you thought Evil Dead was graphic. You have to watch Suspiria or Zombie or whatever. And it was just sort of constantly upping the ante of all of these things. Um, which brings me to something about Faces of Death that I think is fascinating, watching it now. And I'm curious to get your thoughts, having rewatched it for the first time in however many years. It's a movie that doesn't, like, if you were to put like a 16-year-old down in front of this movie now and say watch this movie, it almost doesn't make sense because because the internet has made access to this kind of stuff so easy and widespread. And I remember that from high school, like going through, like, rotten.com was the
Yep.
thing that people would go to and look at gross stuff, and you would have arguments with your friends. Well, that one's clearly fake. Look, no, but this one is real, and this one came
Hmm.
from this, and it's a different experience where, like, Faces of Death, when it came out, was presented entirely as like, no, this is the real thing. This is all death, and and what's freaky about it now too is, like, there's a bit at the end that is a famous plane crash, like
Yep.
an actual real plane crash that happened in the late 1970s in America, and they bought like home movie footage from people in the neighborhood where this plane
Yep.
crashed. So, like, you see body parts from a plane crash, and it's one of those things where you like, I can't imagine a movie coming out today that's not presented as a full-on documentary about a tragedy that's deadly serious. I can't imagine someone making a fiction film now and going like, "Oh, we inserted footage of real human corpses that had just died in a fiery plane crash in it." People would lose their minds,
Oh my God.
and yet it like you would still be able to go to like CNN and go and be like, see the moment that the plane careened
Yeah.
into the building. And um like you mentioned the shots that you remember freaking you out as a kid still hitting like they did when you were a kid. What was the experience like for you, having seen sort of the evolution of our appetite for real life violence, like
Yeah, it's
watching it
interesting.
now?
And this is so relevant to kind of what I was saying earlier about Purple Satin Killer and our relationship to violence on screen, real or fake, and and just how that's kind of changed over the years. And it's funny that Faces of Death really was like a precursor to Rotten.com, you know? And so rewatching it all this time later, I watched it with my wife who had never seen it, and we kind of both agreed like it's a really interesting movie as like a time capsule of like, the time it was made. And tonally it's really strange because, and maybe part of it was because I remember so vividly how much the opening autopsy footage really disturbed me because of just how like just like monotone and stark it was, and so unlike an actual movie. And so I still kind of got that impression from it. So when the movie started, I was just like, almost felt like dirty. I was like, oh man, this is a grimy movie. Like this is really kind of off-putting. But then there were also segments that now that I'm older, that like I said before, I realized just how fake they were, and like, being more versed in the conventions of filmmaking, recognizing like, this is shot from multiple angles and this sound isn't diegetic and all this stuff. And like, so like half the movie is like most of like the real footage that they bought, like the stock footage of actual death and stuff like that, all that stuff was kind of really like eerie to me and off-putting. But then on the other end of the spectrum, like some of the other sequences, like the satanic blood orgy and stuff, were like laughable. And like if we were especially paying attention to the music cues, like the music cues in Faces of Death are insane.
Oh, some of them are just like hilariously off
Yeah,
key. It's amazing.
it's so bizarre. Like some of it's like, this kind of just like elevator background music, but then some of it is almost like this whimsical circus music. And at one point, I think it's during the electrocution scene, which is notoriously fake. And that was another scene when I was young. I was like, oh my God, this is the grossest thing I've ever seen. And now I'm like, this is so clearly manufactured. Um, I feel like it was like this like Kenny G like smooth saxophone music just like laid in there really low in the background, and like I mean, it was kind of hysterical. Like, it's just such an odd choice. I don't know why they would have done that, especially if they're going for this realism. Like, maybe they were just taking all the like rights-free music they could get and laying it in there. But it just the music choices were just mind-boggling. Like, it really was weird. So, like, my experience rewatching it again was like kind of, oh yeah, this really was kind of a disturbing movie. And then, oh, but this is also just like laughably cheesy, you know?
Do you remember on your way back through those action films and getting back to horror, do you remember what the first horror movie you watched was that you like enjoyed, that you came away from going like, yeah, this is great?
I do actually. And I was just thinking about this when you were talking about that, is I have a similar experience. Is that as I was older, I think maybe I was, no, I was in college and I had a part-time job, and I met and like I said, I hadn't really seen a lot of movies. I'd gone to a lot of movies, and I worked with a guy who was like super into movies and like saw everything. I was just like wanted to be a screenwriter and a director. And so we became friends and like started hanging out, and I would go over his house, and he had a laser disc player and a big laser disc collection, which I thought was neat. And so I used to he would just start just, showing me all the stuff. He's like, "Oh my God, you never seen this. Oh my God, you never seen this." And so, like I said, I had wanted to kind of condition myself just so I could watch movies like a normal person and not like feel like I was going to throw up. And so I would go over to his house and watch stuff. And I remember, so at this point, I was kind of like, you know, I felt like I could handle watching movies and, it wasn't as upsetting to me. But I still like, I was like, horror movies, that's not for me. I'm not really into that or whatever. And so at his house one time, he put on, it was Evil Dead. And I was like, he was like, let's watch Evil Dead. And I was like, all right, let's do it. And so we watched Evil Dead. And like I said, at that point, I wasn't like, it's, low budget movies, still kind of gnarly, but I wasn't like so, off put that I wanted to like run to the bathroom and throw up or anything like that. And then, but that, watching that movie, I remember being like, oh man, this is kind of cool. Like just this, because I just hadn't seen anything like that before. And I was just like, I don't know, just so new and different. I was just like, oh man, just like you could do anything in a movie, like in horror, like you don't have to follow these real life rules. Like you could just, people could be possessed and become Kandarian demons or whatever. And like, and the movie was funny too, and that helped. And that was really the one that sparked, I think, my appreciation for horror. And after that, I was like, oh, like part of being a cinephile, like horror is a big part of it. And I found that really attractive. And so I started seeking it out.
My I was thinking about the first time I saw Evil Dead, and like I said, it was with those friends when I was a teenager, and we went and rented the DVD, which was probably just come out at the time. And for whatever reason, I still love that movie. I still go back to that movie, but the thing that stuck with me about it in terms of like, oh, this is so creative and cool. It wasn't any of the gore effects. It's that one shot where I think he's in the cellar and the light bulb starts to fill up with blood.
Hmm.
That was the shot where I went, oh, wow, this is like something is happening here beyond just we're going to gross you out. So now that we've talked about that, I'm really curious how appreciating the genre and what it's capable of led for you to writing the genre. Like, when did you find your imagination start to twist in a way that you could write horror stories of your own?
Well, I think, hmm, I've been writing like fiction now, starting with short stories. Maybe it's been about 10 years now. But before that, and this was birthed out of me meeting that friend and getting into movies and becoming really obsessed with movies. Um, he wanted to be a director, he wanted to be a screenwriter. And so I got into screenwriting. Like when I was a kid, I loved to read. And at one point I was like, I want to be a writer. And I even, maybe took some creative writing in high school and college, but I never really sat down and was like, I'm going to write something. But then when I got into movies, it just became a lot more accessible to me that like, oh, I could write a screenplay. And I got this friend who's done it and I'm reading his. I see how it's done. I like movies now. I'm gonna, I want to be a screenwriter. So I spent, a good part of my 20s and maybe early 30s, like trying to be a screenwriter, and I wrote like six, seven, eight screenplays. Um, most by that point, I had a big appreciation of the weird, and I did like horror movies, but I hadn't written anything horror. My stuff was more, just kind of on the weird side, influenced by like kind of like early 90s independent cinema and stuff like that. And then like two or three scripts in, like I wrote my first horror script and I was like, oh yeah, this is it. I like this. And there was just something about the creativity it gave you. You could like the way you could express ideas and you could just, you know, imagine this craziest things you've never heard or never seen. It wasn't just the same old stuff. You could basically do anything in horror, and that's kind of what appealed to me about it. And so then when I realized that, I was spending all this time and effort writing these scripts that nobody was ever going to read, or nobody, except for maybe my friends, I was like, well, if I write some short stories, maybe at least 10 or 15 people will read them and I'll get paid $20. That's more than I'm getting writing screenplays. So that kind of like is what moved me back towards fiction, which was my kind of first love as a kid. I love to read. And So yeah, and again, like I wasn't like fully writing horror, and like I wouldn't even say Letters to the Purple Satin Killer is full on horror. Like it's horrific, and it has to do with serial killers. It might be more, more of a true crime pastiche, but a lot of what I write is either it has a darkness to it, it has weird subject matter. I just like weird, dark stuff, and that's kind of, I don't know, that's just where I gravitate towards, now.
Yeah, and I should mention for listeners, if you haven't picked up Whispers in the Ear of a Dreaming Ape, Joshua's story collection, you should go get it because it is you will get horror and dark things, but there's also, science fiction and fantasy and crime and all of those things peppered in. And this kind of gets me to the longer I do this show, the easier it is to articulate what I like about horror. And this conversation that we're having reminds me of when Josh Mallerman was here, and we talked about Twilight Zone the movie, and he talked about the importance of that film showing him that you can do anything in
Hmm.
horror because it was like five stories in one, and so you really could go anywhere. And now you're talking about it in this way, and I think that is the core enjoyment, at least now. I think we've already talked about that phase of like you got to endure whatever the grossest thing, which I still have a long way to go on that. I'll admit freely, like I've never seen Cannibal Holocaust, and I probably won't see it until
Mm.
some demented writer comes on this show and says, "I want to talk about Cannibal Holocaust." Okay, I guess I have to watch that. Um, yeah, it's the creativity of it that gets me the most. So, I guess to close, and we may have already covered this, we may be going back over ground that we've already touched on, but because you have sort of laid out this journey of being freaked out by Thriller as a kid, being completely put off by the combination of Faces of Death, and which that the sleepover you described, The Exorcist, famously one of the best sound designs of any horror film ever. I
Hmm.
cannot imagine just laying in a room as a little kid and hearing The Exorcist
It's so
next
effective.
door. Yeah, I can't like if you ever want to like give yourself nightmares for 2 weeks, put on headphones, close your eyes, and just listen to The Exorcist. You will lose your mind. So going from that experience to then uh, sort of talking yourself into, and like you said, conditioning yourself to be able to watch first like popular cinema of all kinds with any kind of violence in it, and then horror, to now when you're writing about this stuff and digging deeper into it, like what is and you can answer this as a fan, as a creator, however you want, but like what does horror give you now after all of that?
Hmm. Um, I mean, I mean, as a writer, partially, like you said, it's the creative freedom. I just think all the most interesting ideas are taking place in like horror and like the like the new weird and stuff like that, just like no rules, like any it's not just stuff you would see in everyday life, so it's just like it could be anything. It's just total creative freedom, and I've as a writer, like that's definitely why I gravitate towards that stuff. Like maybe it wasn't that way in the beginning when I was conditioning myself and watching movies and stuff, like there was a thrill to it, but I just think the most interesting ideas are in horror for me as a reader and a writer and a viewer. Like just it has the most potential to show me something I've never seen before. And at this point, you've seen and read a lot of things. It's harder and harder be to 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 find something new and exciting and different. And I find that most times horror is the place I find that.
That is a great place to close. And watch more horror movies, everybody. Read
Yes.
more horror books, watch more horror movies. Joshua, before we let you go, will you let everyone know where they can find you online?
I have a website that I don't really update, but joshuachaplinsky.com, and I'm on most social medias these days at at JC Cockrobin, which I know isn't ideal, but I think if you just search my name on Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, even what's the other one, the video one, the one the kids like,
TikTok
shows you how much I'm on it. Yeah, I'm on most of them, and yeah, so if you just search my name, you'll probably find me there.
Our guest has been Joshua Chaplinsky. Joshua, thanks for being on the show. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, man, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks once again to Joshua Chaplinsky for being on the show. Letters to the Purple Satin Killer is available now wherever books are sold. Go pick it up. It's fantastic. And be sure to follow Josh on social media. Head to his website. Check it out. Keep track of everything he has going on. And be sure to keep track of everything we have going on by following us on social media. We are mostly posting on Blue Sky these days. We are at scareshapedus.bsky.social. That is where you will find out who the next guest is going to be, where you'll get links to all the new episodes that we do, links to past episodes. If a past guest has something big coming up, like a book release, you'll also hear about anything else we have going on over there. We're also on Facebook. If you prefer to like and follow the show on Facebook, we're The Scares That Shaped Us over there. We're also on YouTube. If you like subscribing to podcasts, listening to podcasts on YouTube, we are The Scares That Shaped Us over there. Smash that like button, smash that subscribe button. We appreciate the support. You can also email us anytime you like at scares-that-shaped-us-podcast@gmail.com. If you have a question, something you'd like to hear me talk about on the show, a guest that you'd like to see, anything like that, always happy to hear from everybody. That does it for us this week. We will be back next week with a brand new episode. Our guest will be Bram Stoker nominated author Todd Kiesling. We're going to talk to Todd about his new novel, The Sundowners Dance, which, if you are hearing this, The Sundowners Dance is now out in the world. Go pick it up. It's great. We will talk about that. We will also talk about our third Clive Barker story in the short history of this show. We're going to talk about The Great and Secret Show, Barker's epic fantasy horror, dark sci-fi, cosmic horror, weird, ambitious, super imaginative novel, and the impact it had on Todd and the impact it had on young Matthew as well. We both have some very formative horror fandom experiences tied to this novel. So it's a lot of fun. Hope you check that out. That will be April 30th at noon Central. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. I'm Matthew Jackson, and this is The Scares That Shaped Us.